On May the 8th, 1945, Londoners filled the streets. The British nation, famous for its cruelness, now lost its head. Amid the joyful crowds was a Jew from Palestine, David Ben-Gurion, who wrote in his diary, "The day of victory, sad, very sad." Victory over Nazi Germany uncovered the horrors of the Holocaust. Unimaginable atrocities were revealed at the concentration camps. 6 million Jews had been murdered by the Nazis. But the question which would now occupy world opinion was, what about the survivors? Where will they find a home? Who will give them shelter? The Allied victory over Germany brought the message of liberation to more than 10 million people of various nations. Prisoners of war, forced laborers, political prisoners, Jews, the labor force of the Nazi slave empire, were now liberated en masse and headed for the railway stations. Back to the railways, but this time the transport sped in the opposite direction, homeward bound. The Jews who returned to Poland hoped to find that they were indeed returning home, that all the horrors were behind them. But when they arrived at their destination, a bitter surprise awaited them.
When we returned to Poland, the non-Jews, and we had friends among them as well, looked at us. Where did you come from? They saw that we were looking at them disapprovingly, because they were wearing clothes belonging to Jews, living in homes belonging to Jews. They answered, "Poland must be rid of Jews. What Hitler began, we shall finish, without Jews."
Auschwitz did not put an end to anti-Semitism in Poland. Jews were attacked in the streets, on railways. In several cities, pogroms broke out. During the 11 months following liberation, 351 Jews were murdered in Poland. The post-war outbreak of anti-Semitism compelled the few Jews who survived the Holocaust to flee Poland. As the Iron Curtain descended over Europe, slipping across borders became increasingly more complicated. But the most difficult problem the refugees faced was where to go. In 1945, as in Hitler's day, no Western democracy would offer asylum to Jewish refugees. The road to freedom, unbelievably, led back to Germany, the country that had perpetrated the genocide of the Jewish people. Here they found themselves in refugee camps adjacent to the infamous Nazi concentration camps. Realizing that they could not go on, they firmly demanded that the British government open the gates of Palestine. The Jews pinned great hopes on Britain's new Labour government. It was the new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, who had proposed earlier that all Palestine become a Jewish state, and his Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, was likewise an avowed friend of the Zionist movement. But when the cabinet convened at 10 Downing Street to reconsider the Palestine question, it turned out, to the great shock and disappointment of the Jews, that the Labour Party abandoned its pro-Zionist line. This reversal of policy occurred through the advice of pro-Arab experts in the Foreign Office.
To put it very simply, I think our advice was that for Britain to be responsible for creating a Jewish state in the Middle East would do severe and perhaps irreparable damage to our relations with the Arab states.
The Jews of Palestine reacted bitterly and angrily. Crowds of young people took to the streets of Tel Aviv, firmly resolved to resist and fight Britain's policy. At the same time, the Jews started a second front across the Atlantic. American Jews converged on Washington, seeking to recruit the new President Harry Truman to their cause. It was Truman who took the first step in a series of measures which 2 years later would bring about the establishment of the State of Israel.
I got a letter off to Attlee and told him that we ought to start as fast as we could to repatriate as many of the Jews as we could in Israel.
British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin responded to President Truman's appeal by convening an Anglo-American Inquiry Commission. On the way to Palestine, the commission visited the refugee camp at Bergen-Belsen. This camp, and others like it, held 100,000 displaced Jews who were trying to rehabilitate themselves and come back to normal life. Nevertheless, 9 months after liberation, no country would offer them a home.
My name, when I remember it, is Joseph Weil. It is easier for me to remember my number. The number the Nazis gave me in Dachau, when they took away everything but a determination to survive. For myself, I know that I shall go to live and rebuild where my 2 children have found safety and freedom, in Palestine.
On March the 6th, 1946, the Anglo-American Commission arrived in Jerusalem. Here they saw the other side of the problem. The Commission held its meetings at the YMCA building. Representatives of the various sides were summoned to present their testimony, among them Jamal Husseini, chief spokesman for the Arab cause.
For the last 30 years, alien immigrants have been forced upon us and independence denied us. Now these immigrants, though still a minority, want to have a Jewish state in our country, in which we would become the minority. All we ask is to have the natural right of all nations, independence. We seek the setting up of a democratic government in which all genuine citizens will have the same rights and the same obligations.
The key Jewish witness was Dr. Chaim Weizmann, president of the Zionist organization, who told Commission members that they did not have to decide between justice and injustice, but rather, as he defined it, between a major injustice and a minor one. Which is preferable, asked the aged Zionist leader, to commit an injustice against the Arabs, who already have 6 independent states, or the Jews, who have no state at all? Which is the lesser of the 2 evils? short time later, Britain granted independence to Transjordan, making it a seventh Arab state. Emir Abdallah was crowned king. This happened 5 days after the Anglo-American Commission published its recommendations, which called for cancellation of the White Paper and immediate issue of 100,000 entry visas to Palestine for Jewish refugees. Bevin, who was then seeking to strengthen ties with the Arab world, rejected the recommendations of the commission which he himself had appointed. He viewed all pro-Jewish gestures as undermining British interests in the Middle East. At that time, anti-Semitic attacks on Polish Jewry reached a peak, with the pogrom in the city of Kielce. 41 men, women and children were cruelly slaughtered. The attack was triggered by a rumor that the Jews had killed Christian children for ritual purposes. The enlightened world was incapable of believing that a medieval blood libel could take place in the mid-20th century. But the Jews of Poland asked no more questions. Flight from Poland, which until the Kielce pogrom was on the scale of a few thousand per month, now involved tens of thousands. What began as an escape operation now attained the magnitude of a national migration. The British Foreign Office applied pressure on European governments to tighten control on the roads, realizing that the refugees' destinations, Germany or Italy, were only springboards for the leap to Palestine. The most difficult moments for the refugees came as they crossed the Alps into Italy.
We were afraid that the Italians would catch us. We'd go up and down 10 times. We were so afraid we cried silently. We couldn't ask the guide when we would arrive. He was at my side when I couldn't go on. He gave me a hand and dragged me up a bit. I told him quietly, "I can't go on. My legs hurt me so." He said, "Just a bit more. Just a little bit more." This went on until morning.
Accommodations were arranged along the clandestine route. Young people from the Haganah underground organization provided food and care, making sure that refugees gathered enough strength to continue their arduous journey to Palestine. In Palestine, the British now faced a completely new situation. The moderate Haganah underground organization, to which most young Jews belonged, abandoned its policy of self-defense and reached agreement with two small militant organizations, the Irgun and the Stern Group, to launch a coordinated armed struggle against the authorities. The Irgun and the Stern Group were two dissident underground organizations pursued not only by the British, but until this time also by the Jewish establishment. Their posters, pasted up throughout the cities, declared that only the power of the rifle will free the homeland. Their independent activities had aroused opposition among most Jews in Palestine. Yet now Bevin had succeeded in uniting all the rival factions, at least for a short while. On June 17, 1946, Haganah units launched an attack on all bridges linking Palestine with neighboring countries. The British decided to crush the uprising with a strong arm. On Saturday, June 29, 1946, known as the Black Sabbath, the British imposed a general curfew throughout Palestine. They arrested all Jewish leaders who had not managed to escape and took over 27 kibbutzim suspected of serving as Haganah bases, searching them for men and weapons.
The Black Sabbath was an unparalleled provocation. There was danger of paralysis, of depression. Ben-Gurion described it by saying that the Jewish community in Palestine was in danger of suffering a political stroke.
"2,700 young people were arrested on the Black Sabbath and sent to internment camps without trial. But all Britain's efforts to break Jewish resistance were in vain. The King David Hotel was one of the most famous sights in the Middle East. Here kings and statesmen stayed on their visits to the Holy City. But this elegant and luxurious stone building, a landmark of colonial Jerusalem, was not only an hotel. Its southern wing served as the seat of the British government and military headquarters in Palestine. Here was the office of the Chief Secretary of the Mandate government.
At 20 minutes to 1 on the 22nd of July, 1946, there was a dull but very considerable explosion. It was a sort of terrific bump which shook the whole building, brought down a lot of the ceiling and pictures on the walls and things like that in my room, and covered the whole place with dust and with an impenetrable pall of smoke or fumes and dust, which brought practically total darkness.
When the smoke cleared, the southern wing of the King David Hotel was no more. Rescue squads removed from the rubble 91 corpses, Englishmen, Arabs and Jews. Amid the overall shock, the Irgun, commanded by Menachem Begin, announced its responsibility for the attack.
We did not imagine that even one life would be lost. We did our best to ensure that everyone would be evacuated from the King David Hotel. Everything was coordinated between the operations officer of the Haganah and our own. The timing, the warning, which was given in advance. The explosion occurred, just as we had planned it, about half an hour after the telephone warning was given. There were 3 warnings by telephone. The British did not heed our warnings.
No, definitely not. That is a very old story, which was put out by Mr. Begin and the Ergun after the event. I don't want to comment on the story except to say that it is absolutely untrue, that no warning was made to me or any member in the building or reached us in any way whatever. And even if I had have done, even supposing I'd received it, I could not, in the time available, have evacuated the site.
He is lying. It's an outright lie. I, Adina Hai Nisan, received an order to phone the King David Hotel, something which I learned by heart. I practiced how to say it. I called up and said, "This is the Irgun. We have placed explosives in the hotel. Evacuate. This is a warning." I repeated the announcement in 3 languages.
The British reacted with fury to the blowing up of the King David Hotel. 27,000 soldiers and policemen stormed Tel Aviv. A strict curfew was imposed, and thorough house-to-house searches were conducted to find the perpetrators of the attack. Heading the wanted list was Menachem Begin. Every policeman and detective had a copy of this picture. Begin, however, had altered his appearance and was hiding under the alias of Rabbi Israel Sassover.
The British took positions and set up a kind of headquarters in the garden of the small house where we lived in North Tel Aviv. It's still there today. They also detained my wife. They took her in for questioning. But I was in a certain hiding place within the house throughout all these searches. Conditions were very difficult. I had nothing there. Most important was that there was no water. You can get by without food, even for a long time. But without water, in August, beneath the roof, and the sun beating down on the roof and on your head, because your head practically touches the roof, to be without water is very difficult. Therefore, when I descended, the first thing I asked for, in a hoarse voice, was water. They gave me a bucket of water, and I stuck my head in and drank. I couldn't wait. I had no patience. I was completely dry. Water, water. That's what was missing.
The president of the Zionist organization, Dr. Chaim Weizmann, was in Rehovot that summer. Here, the statesman-scientist had his laboratory, later to develop into the Weizmann Institute. Weizmann objected vigorously to the violent struggle in which the Zionist movement was embroiled. Threatening to resign, he demanded that the Haganah cease its military activities.
I was ordered to go to Chaim Weizmann. This was the first time in my life that I met Weizmann face to face. I had some highly ambivalent attitudes towards Weizmann. On the one hand, I admired him greatly from childhood. I saw in him the king of the Jews. On the other hand, there was hearsay that he was too much of a compromiser, and so on. The conversation was unforgettable. He told me, this ceasefire is only temporary. In a national struggle, he said, one may act when necessary and also refrain from action when necessary. I have determined that now is the time to refrain.
Thus ended the short-lived cooperation among the Jewish underground organizations. The Haganah would now devote itself primarily to smuggling Holocaust survivors into Palestine. So-called illegal immigrant ships sailed to Palestine, one after another, at an average frequency of one every 10 days. Royal Navy succeeded in capturing all such ships on the high seas, but the battle was difficult and the victory embarrassing. The immigrants did not give up easily, and the battles they waged on deck brought no honor to Great Britain.
Another shipload of human misery sails into Haifa Harbor. Refugee ship brought in by a British boarding party after a 2-day sea chase. Some seek vainly to escape as their comrades offer resistance on deck. Theirs is a hopeless attempt.
At the port of Haifa, where the ships were towed for deportation of the illegals to Cyprus, reporters and film crews recorded the proceedings. Their reports served the Jewish cause in the struggle for world public opinion.
Like cattle, back to exile. 4,000, the largest contingent of unauthorized immigrants ever to reach the Holy Land. The doors to the promised land again closed to the victims of man's inhumanity to man.
The Ergun and Stern Group totally rejected the Zionist leadership's demand to refrain from violent acts. The two dissident organizations continued to attack government targets incessantly, making life increasingly difficult for the British. The authorities reacted forcefully, but to no avail. They fenced and fortified government offices, but the underground still succeeded in penetrating them. After each such act, passers-by were arrested and stood up against a wall. Fighters caught with weapons were brought to court in chains. Then began a series of death sentences and hangings. The most daring Ergun activity was the storming of Acre prison and the release of many underground fighters incarcerated there. British unease increased. Soldiers traveled in armored vehicles, their guns cocked. Train travel was disrupted, and His Majesty's forces found themselves serving as railway guards. A sign for the future was the decision to evacuate families of civilians and soldiers to Britain. These pictures show the beginning of the end of the British presence in Palestine. It happened when the British government decided to submit the Palestine question to the United Nations.
His Majesty's government in the United Kingdom, having submitted the problem of Palestine to the United Nations, I desire on their behalf to express their appreciation of the manner in which this special assembly has devoted time and effort to devising this first step towards a solution of the problem.
What was Britain's true position in 1947? In Jerusalem, Mandate authorities carried on business as usual, as if they were prepared to continue ruling Palestine for another 50 years. Political observers speculated that Britain had passed the problem to the United Nations not in order to find solutions, but rather in order not to find one, relying on the Soviet Union, which at that time was vetoing all Western initiatives.
Now, I call on the delegate of Soviet Union. Maintenant la parole au délégué de l'Union soviétique.
Господин председатель, то обстоятельство, что ни одно западноевропейское государство не оказалось в состоянии обеспечить защиту элементарных прав еврейского народа, объясняет стремление евреев к созданию своего
Andrei Gromyko's speech was the greatest surprise of the Assembly session. The representative of the Soviet Union, the historic enemy of the Zionist movement, spoke of the right of the Jewish people to independence, thus removing the main obstacle on the path towards the State of Israel. The General Assembly session concluded with the appointment of a special commission called UNSCOPE, which was to visit Palestine, study the problem, and propose a solution. People felt that this was simply another committee, whose fate would be no different from that of all the other committees in the history of the mandate which had submitted recommendations that were never carried out. The UNSCOPE Commission held its meetings at the Jerusalem YMCA building, where various witnesses were invited to present their testimony. Among them were David Ben-Gurion and his young liaison officer, Abba Eban. Ben-Gurion, chairman of the Zionist executive, the man who would become first prime minister of the State of Israel 1 year later, expressed the hope that the commission would hand down a just verdict.
You will achieve your mission successfully when you restore freedom to Palestine, give justice to the Jewish people, and stability, progress, and prosperity to the Middle East. These three objectives can be accomplished by the immediate abolition of the White Paper, the establishment of a Jewish state, and the promotion of Jewish-Arab alliance. I thank you.
On July 18, 1947, an illegal immigrant ship was towed to the port of Haifa. This dilapidated riverboat, with 4,500 people packed inside it, was the Exodus. The Exodus had been captured on the high seas after a fierce battle, in which 3 immigrants were killed and 100 wounded. These scenes of immigrants disembarking, taking a few steps along the pier of their beloved homeland en route to the deportation ships, had become routine in 1947. However, this particular scene was without precedent. It reflects all that took place during those final hours on the decks of the Exodus. On that very day, 2 UNSCOPE members visited the port. The chairman, Justice Sandström of Sweden, and the Yugoslavian representative, Simic. "This is the best testimony of all," commented the Yugoslav.
ניגשה אם עם ילד ואמרה,
A woman with a child said she had wandered enough.
שהיא כבר נדדה מספיק.
She wanted to raise her family in the land of Israel.
ההרגשה הזאת הייתה לכולנו.
All of us shared this feeling.
מספיק הנדודים.
We had wandered long enough. We wanted to come to the land of Israel.
As they traveled throughout Palestine, unscoped members were most impressed by the kibbutzim. The pioneers had always settled the most neglected lands. They dried up the swamps and made the desert bloom. The commission was especially amazed by the visit to Beit Ha'arava, a kibbutz on the shores of the Dead Sea. Tomatoes were grown in its saline soil, which had never supported any crops before. The unscoped members' stay in Palestine ended in a tour of Jerusalem, the holy city. The commission was now ready to depart for Geneva, discuss the issue, and draft suggestions regarding the future of Palestine. No sooner did the commission leave Palestine when fresh violence erupted. It began with the British, who hanged 3 condemned Irgun members in this cell at Acre Prison. A heavy pall of mourning descended upon the Jewish community. The next day, 2 British sergeants, kidnapped by the Irgun and held as hostages, were found hanging in a eucalyptus grove near Netanya. This retaliatory act widened the rift in the Jewish community. The Haganah declared, the dissidents have carried out a most atrocious crime.
We repeatedly warned them, don't do it. Don't hang our comrades, don't hang them. But the British would not heed our warnings, so we had no choice but to retaliate. Of course, it was a cruel retaliation. We knew this and said so explicitly. I even received a letter from the father of one of the sergeants. I replied that he should blame Whitehall for the fact that his son was one of the victims. We did not want to kill his son or his friend. All we wanted was to save our own comrades' lives. But we could not. Had it not been for this retaliation, scores or even hundreds more of our fighters would have gone to the gallows.
Violence continues to rule in Palestine. British soldiers seek bodies in the Department of Labor building at Chechnik, where a few minutes before, a blast had partially wrecked the edifice. 3 policemen were blown to bits when they tried to remove an explosive-laden truck. Shaky walls are torn down. As the toll of dead mounts daily in the bitter war of reprisals, tight security measures are imposed by the British. Scores of Jewish leaders are jailed and rigid searches are conducted for terrorist weapons. These measures follow the hanging of 2 British sergeants by extremists. Palestine becomes an armed camp.
In September 1947, the UN General Assembly convened in Flushing Meadows, New York. On the agenda were the unscoped recommendations to end the British mandate and partition Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab.
The Jewish people needed 2/3 to have the resolution passed. On the Arab side, 1/3 of the votes was enough to cancel the resolution. I witnessed a demonstration in actual political science in action, which to me was equal a whole full semester of college study of politics. The pressure politics that was applied, the economic promises and persuasions, the propaganda, the breathing down the throats of the delegates, the long-distance telephone calls to various heads of states to get their UN delegates to shift votes. To the Arabs, the session was left to luck, and they rallied mostly in good faith of the delegates. To the Jewish people, politics was not a gamble. It was a science. So they used every technique possible to win the elections.
We did succeed in persuading a sufficient number of our fellow delegates to see the right as we saw it. Cette proposition montre que le monde arabe veut à tout prix éviter un conflit qui pourrait avoir des conséquences fort regrettables.
We say there is a disease, there is a patient before us.
And then came November 26, 1947, the day the UN was to vote on whether the Jews would have their own state.
Which other delegations contest, and which is at the essence of the whole problem, of the whole Palestinian problem.
لأنه يفرض نظاما من الحياة على شعب بدون رضائه وبصورة غريبة عن النظام العالمي.
Ce projet restera le plus grand scandale politique de tous les siècles.
As the deliberations proceeded, the Jewish delegates began to feel increasingly uncomfortable.
There was a clear and determined majority of speakers who opposed partition and the establishment of a Jewish state. One by one they rose, including representatives of countries whom we were sure would support us, who had promised us. I no longer recall the names of those countries, but one after another the speakers stressed all the negative aspects of the solution as we sat there, debased.
It was a black Wednesday. The Jewish representatives understood that their only hope was to postpone the vote for a day or two. Nachum Goldman appealed to two Latin American friends for assistance.
I told them, you have to request the floor again. The fabricat said, listen, I've already spoken 3 times. I told him, read the Bible like a Senate filibuster. Read Psalms, the promises of Isaiah. So they asked to speak again. Time was 6:15, and the Arabs were beginning to sense some kind of plot. So they shouted, to vote. The Iranian said, I still have a list of speakers. He had a wonderful scheme. He really saved us. At exactly 7 o'clock, he rose and said, gentlemen, we've had a long and dramatic debate of historical importance. It demands further consideration.
I adjourn the meeting. We'll meet Friday morning.
We divided the map of the world into the recalcitrant countries. Everybody was put in charge of a special mission. I remember that Weizmann, for example, had to make a big effort in Paris. He telephoned to Léon Blum, he telephoned to other leaders in order to bring about a change in their position. I remember a cable in which he said, can the voice of France be absent from this great moment of history? We found friends of Israel, Jews and others in such places as the Philippines, in Liberia. We discovered that in Liberia the greatest commercial enterprise was the Firestone enterprise. We looked for Mr. Firestone. Unimaginable the detail with which we developed this work, and what of course helped us very much was the knowledge that President Truman had become irritated with the reluctance of his delegation and his State Department to promote a favorable vote.
I think that it will be readily recognized by all the delegates.
When the Assembly reconvened 2 days later, the President still thought the partition plan would not succeed. Political maneuvers continued throughout that day. The Arabs and Jews fought to the very last minute.
We will proceed the roll call. You all know how to vote. Those who are in favor will say yes. Those who are against will say no. And the abstainers, always they know what to say. We will start it now.
Afghanistan? No. Argentina? Argentina? Abstention? Australia? Yes.
On November 29th, 1947, Jews all over the world held their breath. In New York and Moscow, Buenos Aires and Tehran, Rome and Jerusalem, Jews sat spellbound by the voices coming from their radios in that unforgettable broadcast from Flushing Meadows, New York. The vote, which seemed as long as the Jewish exile itself, lasted only 3 minutes.
Ethiopia? Abstain? France? Yes.
I call on the public, and I hope that you will not have any interference on the voting on the debate. I am confident on the way you will behave in a so serious decision taken by this assembly, because I am decided not to allow anybody to interfere in our decisions.
United Kingdom? Abstain? United States? Yes. Uruguay? Yes. Venezuela? Yes. Yemen? No. Yugoslavia? Abstain. 6, 10.
I had hopes, but I didn't know. I sat near Ralph Bunch. He had a list of the countries in front of him. He recorded the way each country voted. I couldn't concentrate and count the votes. Until the very last minute when he told me the results, I had no idea what it was.
The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
As the result was made public, a wave of ecstasy swept over the Jews of Palestine. They now experienced what generations of Jews before them could only imagine in their dreams. All Jewish history seemed to have been directed toward this moment. On that same day, Jews gathered beneath the Arch of Titus in Rome. This triumphal arch, honoring the Roman Caesar who had destroyed Jerusalem, symbolized the beginnings of the Jewish problem. Here they offered prayers of thanksgiving, declaring that the land which had fallen captive 2,000 years ago had now risen to life once again. No longer were the Jews without a home. They had come full circle.